Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Game Lore, or if this is your first time here, welcome to the Wasteland. Tonight we are going back to the Mojave, to the desert and the river and the two armies that spent 30 years building toward a single moment on a dam in the Nevada sand. We are going to talk about the New California Republic and Caesar's Legion, where they came from, what they believed, what they did to each other, and to everyone caught between them, and what any of it means. This one is long, so get comfortable. And before we get into it, if you feel like it, drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is where you are. It would genuinely mean a lot to see where everyone is listening from. Whether you're up late or winding down or somewhere in between, I am glad you are here. All right, let us begin. The Colorado runs south through canyon country past red rock walls that were already ancient when the first human beings crossed the Bering Land Bridge, past formations that remember a time before mammals, before flowering plants, before anything that would recognize itself in a mirror. 200 years ago, when the bombs came down and the sky turned the color of a bruise that never heals, the Colorado kept moving. It did not care about the war. It did not care about the missiles or the politics or the ideological standoff that had been building for decades between two superpowers who both believed, with complete sincerity, that they deserved to inherit the Earth. The river just moved, the way it always had, carrying silt south toward a delta that no longer exists, cutting deeper into rock that has no memory of human ambition. By the year 2281, 203 years after the last bombs fell, that river has become the most important border in the known world. On its western bank, the ruins of a place called Las Vegas have been transformed into something improbable and bright, a city of neon and electricity that never went dark, a place called New Vegas that runs on the power generated by a massive pre-war dam a few miles upstream. On its eastern bank, there is nothing. No settlements, no lights. Only the occasional patrol of soldiers in loincloths and segmented armor, moving silently through terrain they have spent years learning to kill in. And above it all, on the dam itself, the flags of the New California Republic snap in the desert wind, a bear on a field of red. The symbol of a nation that has marched 1,500 miles east from its homeland, and now finds itself standing at the edge of something it does not fully understand. To understand what is about to happen at that dam, to understand why 200,000 soldiers are converging on a stretch of concrete in the Nevada desert, why a man who calls himself Caesar has spent 30 years building an army for this single purpose, why the soldiers of the NCR are exhausted and underpaid and still refuse to leave, you have to go back. You have to go back to the beginning, to the ash and the silence, to the first people who looked at the ruins of the old world and decided they were going to try again. This is not a story about heroes. It is not a story about monsters. Both sides in the coming war will commit atrocities. Both sides will also feed people, build roads, maintain order where there was none. The NCR will tax its citizens into poverty and send its soldiers to die for the careers of politicians who have never held a rifle. The Legion will enslave entire populations and execute anyone who questions the word of its god emperor, and both sides will believe with genuine conviction that what they are doing is necessary, that the alternative is worse, that without them the wasteland swallows everything. That sincerity is what makes this worth examining. It is easy to dismiss evil that knows it is evil. What is harder and more instructive is evil that believes it is salvation. Chapter 1. The Old World's Corpse. The United States of America ended on October 23, 2077. It did not end quietly. The exchange lasted approximately 2 hours. Some historians of the post-war period, the ones who pieced together what happened from pre-war documents and military records found in bunkers and government archives, estimate that somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 nuclear warheads detonated over North America alone in that window. The major population centers went first. The military installations went next. Then the secondary targets, the infrastructure, the power grids, the agricultural regions, the transportation hubs. By the time the exchange was over, the country that had spent 270 years accumulating power and culture and contradictions had been reduced to a layer of ash and a persistent atmospheric haze that would block meaningful sunlight for years. What survived was not random. Survival in the post-war world followed patterns that said as much about the old world's priorities as about anything else. Rural areas survived better than urban ones, for obvious reasons. Communities with access to clean water survived better than those without. People with practical skills, farming, medicine, mechanics, construction, survived better than those whose value had been entirely abstract. The lawyers and the marketing executives and the financial analysts whose expertise evaporated the moment the system that made that expertise meaningful ceased to exist, and scattered across the continent. In bunkers built by a government agency called Vault Tech in partnership with the federal government, a carefully selected cross-section of the pre-war population sat in sealed underground facilities and waited for a signal to emerge that in many cases never came. The American West, which is where this story begins, survived somewhat better than other regions. The population density was lower. The terrain was harder, which meant that in the years immediately following the war, when the real killing was done not by radiation, but by starvation and violence, and the collapse of every institutional structure that had previously kept human beings from simply taking whatever they needed from whoever had it, in those years, the spaces between settlements provided a degree of protection that the dense urban corridors of the East Coast did not. This is not to say the West was safe. It was not. The first decades after the war were a period of almost incomprehensible violence and loss. A grinding attrition of the human population that continued long after the initial radiation faded, long after the skies began to clear, long after the first green things started pushing up through the ash. What the bombs created in the most fundamental sense was not a wasteland of death, but a wasteland of absence. The absence of law. The absence of institutional memory, the absence of the 1,000 invisible agreements that make civilization possible, the agreement that currency means something, that contracts will be honored, that the person walking toward you on the road is probably not going to try to kill you. All of that evaporated in 2 hours on an October morning, and rebuilding it, even in the most primitive form, took generations. The creatures that emerged from this absence were varied and often strange. Radiation had done its work on the biology of the American continent in ways that pre-war scientists had never fully modeled. Animals mutated into forms that retained the basic architecture of their ancestors but expressed it in grotesque new configurations: the rad scorpion, the death claw, the bloatfly, the mirrorlurk. Human beings who absorbed enough radiation over enough time changed in ways that the old world would have classified as impossible, becoming ghouls, hairless, leathery, their bodies locked in a slow decay that somehow never completed itself, many of them fully conscious and rational, carrying memories of a world that no longer existed. And in some places, in isolated pockets where the conditions were right, something stranger still, communities of humans who had absorbed so much ambient radiation over so many generations that they had become something that was almost, but not quite, something else entirely. But the majority of the survivors remained recognizably human, which meant they retained all the qualities that had made the old world what it was: the capacity for cooperation and the capacity for cruelty, the drive to build and the drive to destroy, the need for community and the willingness to sacrifice community for personal advantage. The Wasteland did not produce a new kind of human being. It produced the same kind, operating in different conditions. In the immediate aftermath of the war, those conditions selected heavily for violence. The first generation of survivors were people who had either hidden well enough or fought hard enough to still be alive, and the cultures they built reflected that. Raider gangs, loose confederations of armed individuals held together by shared predation rather than any common purpose, became the dominant social form in many regions. They were not ideological. They were not building anything, they were simply taking what they needed from whoever had it, and they were effective at this in the short term because the people they were taking from had no institutional means of resisting them. But raider cultures contain a structural contradiction that eventually destroys them. They are extractive without being productive. They consume resources without generating them. And so, over time, the regions dominated by raider gangs became progressively poorer and more desperate, the prey populations either fleeing or dying or gradually learning to fight back until the gangs themselves fragmented and collapsed or were absorbed into whatever came next. In the ruins of a place that had once been called Los Angeles, and in the fertile valley to its north, and in the scattered settlements of Central California, something was taking shape that looked from certain angles almost like a state. Chapter 2: Shady Sands and the Birth of the NCR. The new California Republic did not spring into existence, it accumulated. The process began, by most accounts, with a settlement called Shady Sands, founded in the early post-war years in the Mojave foothills of what had been Southern California. Shady Sands was not remarkable in its origins. It was a small agricultural community, protected by walls, organized around a water supply, dependent on the labor of everyone within it for the survival of all. Dozens of similar communities had formed across the wasteland in the years after the war, small islands of relative order in a sea of chaos. Most of them did not survive. Shady Sands survived and then did something that most settlements did not do: it grew. Growth, in the wasteland context, is not simply a matter of accumulating more people. More people require more food, more water, more security, more organization. Each expansion of a settlement's population creates new problems that must be solved institutionally before the settlement can absorb the next wave of growth. The communities that failed to grow were usually not destroyed by outside forces. They were destroyed by their own inability to develop the administrative structures that growth requires. Shady Sands, for reasons that are partly attributable to the quality of its early leadership and partly attributable to geography and luck, managed this transition. The early leadership of Shady Sands included, prominently, a man named Aradesh and, later, his daughter Tandi, who would go on to become one of the most consequential political figures in post-war American history. Aradesh was a survivor of Vault 15, one of the Vault tech installations that had been designed, in the official story, as shelters for the civilian population, but which in practice had served as social experiments, each one designed with a unique variable introduced into its population to observe the effects. The survivors of Vault 15, who founded Shady Sands, carried with them something most wasteland communities did not have: pre-war institutional knowledge. Not just practical knowledge, though that too, they knew how to purify water, how to rotate crops, how to perform basic medicine. They also carried, in fragmentary form, an understanding of what governance looked like, what laws were, what rights meant. This knowledge was incomplete and often distorted by the conditions of the vault and the years of hardship that followed emergence, but it was there, and it shaped the culture of Shady Sands in ways that distinguished it from communities that had no such inheritance. Tandi's ascent to leadership. She would eventually serve as president of the NCR for over 50 years, from 2196 to 2248, marked the beginning of the Republic's serious expansion. Under her direction, Shady Sands began to absorb neighboring settlements through a combination of military protection, trade agreements, and political negotiation that was sophisticated by any standard, and genuinely unprecedented in the post-war West. The model was not conquest, or not primarily conquest, though the NCR military was used when other methods failed. The model was incorporation, the offer of membership in a larger structure that provided security and economic access in exchange for submission to common laws and the payment of taxes. This model worked because it addressed a genuine need. Small, isolated settlements in the wasteland were perpetually vulnerable to raider attacks, to crop failures, to the simple mathematics of a bad winter with too many mouths to feed and not enough stored food. The NCR's offer of protection was not a trick, it was real. Joining the Republic meant that when the raiders came, there were soldiers to call on. It meant that when the harvest failed, there were trade routes along which food could arrive. It meant that disputes over water rights and land boundaries could be adjudicated by a court rather than resolved through violence. For communities that had been operating without any of these things, the offer was compelling. But incorporation always comes with costs, and the NCR's costs were not trivial. The tax burden that came with Republic membership was significant, and it fell most heavily on the communities least able to bear it, the smaller, poorer settlements on the Republic's frontier that received the fewest direct benefits from membership while paying full rates. The NCR's legal system, derived from fragments of pre-war American law filtered through decades of post-war interpretation, was slow, expensive, and systematically advantaged those with the resources to navigate it. The Republic's military, while genuinely effective at large-scale threats, was poorly suited to the kind of dispersed, low-level raider activity that made daily life dangerous for most of its citizens. It could win battles, but it could not be everywhere, and the settlers on the frontier knew this. These contradictions were present from the beginning. Tandi's long presidency managed them through a combination of personal political skill and the relatively straightforward phase of expansion the Republic was in during her tenure. There were still enough unclaimed resources, enough settlements eager for membership, enough external threats that could be used to unite the population, that the internal tensions could be managed without ever being resolved. The problems were deferred. Tandi was old enough and experienced enough to understand that she was deferring them, not solving them, and in her private communications, some of which survive in NCR archives, she expressed genuine concern about what the Republic would look like when the era of easy expansion ended and the bills came due. She died in 2248, at the age of 103, still in office. The problems she had deferred did not wait long to announce themselves. What Tandi understood better than most of her successors was the distinction between a nation's mythology and its reality, and the particular danger of a government that confuses the two. The NCR's founding mythology was one of restoration, the idea that what the Republic was doing was recovering something lost, rebuilding a civilization that had been interrupted rather than ended. This mythology was useful because it gave the Republic's citizens a shared story, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. But it was also dangerous because it encouraged the belief that the problems of the old world were problems of interruption rather than problems of design. That if you could just get the infrastructure back up, just get the economy moving again, just get the institutions functioning, if you could just restore the form of the old civilization, then the content would follow. That the inequality and the institutional corruption and the democratic deficit were temporary distortions that would correct themselves once things were running properly. They would not correct themselves. They were not distortions. They were features built into the design from the beginning, reproduced faithfully in every successive generation of the Republic's political class because they served the interests of the people with the most power to shape that class. Tandi knew this. She spent 52 years trying to manage the consequences of it without ever having the political capital to address the causes. Whether that constitutes wisdom or failure depends on what you think leadership is for, and that is not a question with a clean answer. Chapter 3. The Republic Takes Shape. By the mid-23rd century, the new California Republic had become something that the old world would have recognized, at least in its broad outlines, as a functioning state. It had a capital, Shady Sands, now a city of tens of thousands, with permanent government buildings and a legislature and a court system and all the administrative apparatus that a functioning government requires. It had a currency, the NCR dollar, backed initially by gold reserves held in a facility called Fort Knox West, and later, after those reserves were stolen in an incident that would have long-lasting economic consequences, by nothing at all except the Republic's political authority, which is a more fragile foundation than most citizens understood. It had a military, the NCR Army, organized into numbered regiments, equipped with a mixture of salvaged pre-war weapons and locally manufactured equipment, led by officers who had been trained in something approaching a professional military tradition. And it had a population, by 2281, of somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million people, a number that would have seemed impossible to the survivors of the immediate post-war period, a genuine nation-state carved out of the ruins of civilization. The government of the NCR was nominally democratic, modeled loosely on the pre-war American system that its founders had inherited in fragmentary form from the vault records and the personal memories of people old enough to have lived through the last years of the old world. There was a president, elected for terms. There was a Congress with representatives apportioned among the Republic's various territories. There were elections, though the mechanics of those elections were imperfect and subject to manipulation, particularly in the outer territories where the distance from the capital made oversight difficult. There were political parties, the Brahman Barons and the Caps Coalition and several others whose names had shifted over the decades as the Republic's political landscape evolved, and those parties competed for power in ways that were recognizably political in the old world sense. With all that entailed, the log rolling and the patronage and the deliberate obscuring of inconvenient facts and the tendency to prioritize the interests of whoever had the most resources to deploy in an election over the interests of whoever had the most need. The Republic's economy was primarily agricultural. The fertile valleys of California were genuinely productive land, and the NCR's farmers, working with salvaged pre-war seeds and irrigation infrastructure that the Republic had invested substantially in rebuilding, produced surpluses that fed the cities and generated the export revenue that paid for the military. Ranching was also significant. Brahman, the two-headed bovine mutants that had replaced cattle as the primary large domesticated animal in the post-war West, were raised in enormous numbers across the Republic's central territories, and the Brahman barons who controlled the largest herds had become the Republic's wealthiest and most politically influential class, their interests well represented in the Congress and, many critics argued, overrepresented. The political economy of the NCR, examined closely, was an oligarchy wearing democratic clothing. This was not a secret or a scandal. It was simply the way things were, the predictable result of allowing wealth to accumulate without structural constraints, something the pre-war American system had also struggled with and ultimately failed to solve. The Brahman barons wanted land and water and cheap labor and low taxes and military protection for their caravans and their herds, and they funded the politicians who delivered these things. The small farmers and the urban workers and the settlers on the frontier wanted security and fair prices and functioning courts and protection from raiders, and they voted for politicians who promised these things, and then watched those politicians serve the interests of the people who had funded them instead. The military was the institution that most NCR citizens were likely to encounter directly, either as soldiers themselves or as the recipients of military protection or military demands. The NCR Army was a large, expensive, imperfectly organized force that had been built for the kind of conventional warfare that the Republic's expansion had historically required, clearing raider strongholds, pacifying newly incorporated territories, defending against the occasional organized outside threat. It was not well suited to the kind of counterinsurgency and territorial occupation that the Mojave campaign would eventually demand of it, a mismatch between institutional design and operational reality that would cost the Republic enormously. The officer corps was divided, roughly, between a professional class of career soldiers who had risen through the ranks and a political class of officers whose commissions reflected connections rather than competence. This division created a persistent tension between operational effectiveness and institutional politics that played out most visibly in the Mojave, where the commanders with the clearest understanding of the tactical situation were frequently overruled by commanders whose primary concern was how the situation would look in the reports sent back to Shady Sands. The NCR's relationship with technology was complicated and somewhat paradoxical. The Republic officially celebrated the pre-war legacy. Its founding mythology was built around the idea of rebuilding civilization, of recovering what had been lost, and this included technological recovery. The Republic invested in infrastructure, in manufacturing, in the scientific and engineering capacity needed to maintain and eventually expand on the pre-war baseline. But this investment was uneven and often frustrated by the same political economy that frustrated everything else. Research that promised near-term returns for powerful interests was funded. Research that might have transformed the Republic's long-term capabilities, but that required patience and had no obvious immediate beneficiary, was not. The result was a civilization that was genuinely impressive by post-war standards, more organized, more productive, more technologically capable than almost anything else in the Wasteland. But that was also carrying within it the seeds of the same failures that had destroyed the old world. The inequality, the institutional capture, the gap between what the Republic claimed to be and what it actually was, these were not new problems. They were very old problems, wearing new clothes, operating in a new landscape, but no closer to being solved than they had ever been. The NCR's expansion east into Nevada was driven by two things that the Republic's leadership would not have admitted were in tension with each other: strategic necessity and economic appetite. The strategic case was real and defensible. The Hoover Dam, the massive pre-war hydroelectric installation on the Colorado River, miraculously intact after 2 centuries, represented a power generation capacity that dwarfed anything the Republic currently possessed. Control of the dam meant control of an energy supply that could power NCR cities for generations, that could drive the industrial expansion the Republic needed to maintain its military advantage and its economic growth. In purely strategic terms, securing the dam was rational. But the economic case was more complicated and less flattering. The Mojave was also the gateway to New Vegas, which, under the control of a pre-war artificial intelligence called Mr. House, had become the most economically productive single location in the post-war West. The caps, the bottle cap currency that served as the Mojave's primary medium of exchange, flowed through New Vegas in quantities that dwarfed anything the NCR's internal economy generated. The Brahman barons and the merchants and the political class who financed NCR expansion were not primarily motivated by strategic vision. They were motivated by the prospect of access to that wealth. The dam was the justification. New Vegas was the prize. This distinction mattered because it shaped how the NCR conducted itself in the Mojave from the moment its soldiers arrived. A purely strategic operation to secure the dam would have looked different from an economic occupation designed to extract value from the region while spending as little as possible on the people living in it. The NCR's Mojave campaign looked like the second thing. The soldiers were underpaid and undersupplied. The civilian population of the region was taxed and regulated without receiving proportionate services in return. The political appointments in the Mojave were patronage positions filled by people whose primary qualification was their connection to influential figures back in Shady Sands. And the soldiers on the ground, who could see the gap between the Republic's stated values and its actual conduct, responded with the full range of human reactions to institutional betrayal. Some with cynicism, some with resigned professionalism, some with anger, and some by simply checking out, going through the motions of soldiering while waiting for their service term to end and counting the days until they could go home. By 281, the NCR military presence in the Mojave numbered in the tens of thousands, spread across dozens of outposts and installations from the Nevada state line to the western bank of the Colorado. It was, by any objective measure, a massive commitment of military resources. It was also, by the assessment of most of the senior officers who served there, an unsustainable one. Too many soldiers spread across too much territory, with supply lines too long and too vulnerable, facing an enemy whose operational approach was specifically designed to exploit exactly those weaknesses. The soldiers were tired. The officers were frustrated. The politicians back in Shady Sands were asking why the Mojave campaign was costing so much and delivering so little. And on the eastern bank of the Colorado, patient as the river itself, the Legion was watching all of this and taking careful notes. This is what the new California Republic was when it arrived at the edge of the Mojave. Not a villain, not a hero, a nation, with all the complexity and contradiction that word implies, capable of genuine greatness and genuine cruelty, often at the same moment, often by the same institution, often in the service of the same policy. A civilization that believed in its own mythology hard enough to keep marching east long after the evidence suggested that the mythology and the reality had diverged beyond easy reconciliation. On the other side of the river, something was waiting that had no mythology at all. Or rather, something was waiting that had replaced mythology with a single, absolute, deeply considered philosophical position about what human beings were and what they deserved. Something that had looked at everything the NCR represented and concluded with cold precision that it was not a civilization in decline, but a civilization that had never worked and never would. That something had a name. It had started as a man, though by 2281 it was difficult to say how much of the man remained. It had started as a graduate student from a place called the Followers of the Apocalypse, a scholar of pre-war history who had walked east into the tribal territories with a backpack full of books and come back with an army. His name, before he changed it, was Edward Sallow. Chapter 4. Edward Sallow. There is a particular kind of intelligence that is dangerous, not because it is wrong, but because it is right about the wrong things. Edward Sallow was born sometime around 2226 in the territories controlled by the Followers of the Apocalypse, a humanitarian organization based in the Boneyard, the ruins of what had once been Los Angeles, whose mission was the preservation and dissemination of pre-war knowledge. The Followers were, by the standards of the Wasteland, an idealistic organization. They believed that the catastrophe of the Great War had been produced by ignorance and tribalism, and the failure of human institutions to constrain human destructiveness, and that the solution was education, the careful, patient work of recovering what the old world had known, and making that knowledge available to everyone, not just the powerful. They ran hospitals in the Boneyard. They sent scholars into the Wasteland to document what had survived and to teach reading and basic medicine to communities that had lost both. They were, in the most straightforward sense of the word, trying to help. Sallow grew up in this environment, and it shaped him in ways he would later disavow but never entirely escape. He was educated, genuinely, rigorously educated, in a way that almost no one in the post-war world was. He read history. Not just the fragments and summaries that passed for historical knowledge in most wasteland communities, but primary sources, pre-war books salvaged from libraries and private collections, academic texts on political philosophy and military history, and the rise and fall of civilizations. He was particularly drawn to the ancient world, Rome in particular, the arc of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire, the mechanics of how a city-state had organized itself into a continental power, the ways in which Roman institutions had managed for several centuries to channel human violence into productive ends. He read Caesar and Livy and Tacitus and Gibbon, and he thought carefully about what they meant. and he came to conclusions that the followers of the apocalypse, had they understood them, would have found alarming. The conclusions were, in brief, that the pre-war world had not been destroyed by ignorance. It had been destroyed by the specific failure mode of democratic liberalism, the tendency of free societies to fragment into competing interest groups, each pursuing its narrow advantage, until the collective action problems became insoluble and the civilization collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions. That the solution was not more education or better institutions within the liberal democratic framework, because that framework was itself the problem. That what the post-war world needed was not a restoration of the old civilization, but a replacement of it, something harder, more coherent, more capable of the kind of collective discipline that survival actually required, and that the model for this replacement had existed before the pre-war world, had in fact built the foundations on which the pre-war world had stood, and could be recovered and applied to the Wasteland context with the right intellectual framework and the right opportunities. The model was Rome, not the late Republic, not the decadent empire, not the slow collapse that Gibbon had documented with such melancholy precision. The early Republic and the early empire, the Rome of the legions, of the census and the road and the aqueduct, of the absolute subordination of the individual to the collective project of civilization. The Rome that had looked at the chaos of the ancient Mediterranean and said, "This ends now, we are going to build something here, and it is going to last, and everyone within reach of it is going to be part of it, whether they choose to be or not." This was not a conclusion that Sallow reached suddenly. It developed over years, through a process of reading and reflection and growing disillusionment with the followers' approach, which he had come to regard as well-intentioned but fundamentally naive, the assumption that offering people knowledge and medical care would somehow produce, over time, the kind of civilizational coherence that history suggested could only be produced by force. He watched the followers do their careful, patient work, and he watched the wasteland remain what it was, violent, fragmented, organized around the predatory dynamics of the strong taking from the weak, and he concluded that the followers were wrong, not about the diagnosis, but about the treatment. The wasteland did not need to be educated, it needed to be conquered. What made Sallow's intellectual development unusual was not that he reached cynical conclusions about idealism that was common enough in the wasteland, where the gap between good intentions and good outcomes was wide and visible. What was unusual was that he reached those conclusions through a sustained engagement with the historical record rather than through simple personal disillusionment. He was not a man who had tried to help people and been disappointed. He was a man who had studied the history of civilizations and concluded, with methodical precision, that the things the followers believed in, education, voluntary cooperation, the gradual accumulation of shared knowledge as a basis for social improvement, were historically associated with the decline phases of civilizations rather than their construction phases. That the great civilizations had not been built by consensus, they had been built by force, by the imposition of order on populations that had not requested it and did not initially welcome it. And that the wasteland, in this analysis, was not a special case requiring a new approach. It was a very old case requiring a very old solution. His colleagues and the followers found him difficult. His arguments were too well-sourced to dismiss easily, too systematic to deflect with the usual appeals to human dignity. The senior scholars who engaged with him most seriously came away from those conversations unsettled, not because they agreed with him, but because they could not always identify the specific point at which his logic went wrong, and in the wasteland, that kind of uncertainty about someone's reasoning was uncomfortable. In 2246, Sallow was 20 years old, and he was sent east with a small expedition of followers into the tribal territories of what had once been Arizona and New Mexico. The expedition's purpose was scholarly, to document the tribes of the region, to make contact with them, to assess opportunities for followers' outreach. Sallow went as a translator and researcher. He brought his books, he brought his conclusions, and he brought, though he could not have articulated this at the time, the specific quality that distinguishes a theorist from a revolutionary, the willingness to stop thinking about what should be done and start doing it. What he found in the tribal territories would give him everything he needed. Chapter 5: The Burned Man and the Making of Caesar. The tribes of the Arizona and New Mexico wasteland in the mid-23rd century were not primitive in any meaningful sense of the word. They were the product of 2 centuries of post-war adaptation, cultures that had developed in the specific conditions of the deep desert, organized around water sources, shaped by the particular ecology of the post-war Southwest, incorporating fragments of pre-war American culture alongside the pragmatic improvisations of survival. They were varied. Some were relatively peaceful, organized around trade and agriculture. Some were warlike, raiding their neighbors for resources and slaves in the familiar wasteland pattern. Some were something in between, maintaining internal peace while defending aggressively against outside threats. They all had one thing in common: they were losing. The specific threat that the Arizona and New Mexico tribes faced in this period was a confederation called the Blackfoot tribe, one of the more aggressive and effectively organized raiding cultures of the region, skilled at the kind of mobile, high-tempo violence that terrorized settled communities. The Blackfoot were not exceptional in their cruelty or their ambition. They were exceptional in their tactical effectiveness, and the tribes around them had been unable to develop a collective response, each one calculating that the costs of cooperation were too high and the benefits too uncertain, with the result that they faced the Blackfoot individually and were picked apart one by one. Sallow's expedition arrived in this context. The other followers with him saw a humanitarian situation, suffering people who needed help. Sallow saw something else. He saw a laboratory. He saw a set of conditions, multiple competing groups, an external threat, a power vacuum, a population desperate enough to accept radical solutions that were, in their essential structure, exactly the conditions described in the historical sources he had spent his life reading. He had read about men who had walked into situations like this and built empires. He had spent years thinking about what they had done and how they had done it. Now he was standing in the middle of one. He made a decision. It was a decision that, once made, could not be unmade, and that would determine the trajectory of the next 35 years of his life and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who would never know his name. He decided to stop being a scholar. He decided to become Caesar. The first step was teaching the Blackfoot to win differently. Sallow had studied military history with the same attention he had given to political philosophy, and he understood in a way that no one in the Arizona wasteland did, because no one there had access to the same sources. The systematic principles of small unit infantry tactics. He taught the Blackfoot about flanking movements and envelopment. He taught them about fire and maneuver. He taught them about the difference between fighting to raid and fighting to destroy, the specific tactical and psychological transformation required to turn a raiding band into an army. The Blackfoot were effective fighters. With Sallow's instruction, they became something more dangerous, effective soldiers. They began to win, not just raids, victories. The tribes around them that had previously held their own began to fall, and as each tribe fell, Sallow demonstrated the second principle he had derived from his historical reading, the value of incorporation over extermination. The defeated tribes were not destroyed, they were absorbed. Their warriors were integrated into the Legion's structure. The Legion, because by this point Sallow had begun the process of cultural transformation that would eventually produce the organization that the Mojave knew by that name. Their non-combatants became the support structure, the craftspeople, the healers, the cooks, the infrastructure of a military force that needed to sustain itself across long campaigns. And their leaders, the ones who survived and submitted, were given positions within the new hierarchy, their status converted from tribal authority into Legion rank. This process of absorption was not gentle. The cultural transformation Sallow imposed on the tribes he incorporated was total and deliberately destructive of what had come before. Tribal languages were suppressed in favor of a Latin-derived pidgin that Sallow introduced as the Legion's official tongue, not because Latin was practically useful, but because language is identity, and Sallow understood that building a coherent military culture required erasing the prior identities that would otherwise create fault lines within it. Tribal religions were replaced with the cult of Caesar, a carefully constructed ideological system in which Sallow himself was not merely a leader but a god figure, the embodiment of a divine mission to bring order to chaos. Tribal names were replaced with Latin cognomens. Tribal customs, to the extent that they conflicted with Legion doctrine, were forbidden. This was not arbitrary cruelty. Sallow had a model for it, derived from his historical reading, the Roman practice of Romanization, the systematic cultural transformation of conquered peoples that had allowed Rome to build a coherent multi-ethnic empire out of populations that had previously been hostile to each other. He had read about it, he had understood it intellectually. Now he was applying it with the specific advantage that he, unlike the Roman administrators who had developed the practice, had access to the historical record of its effects. He knew what had worked, what had failed, what modifications the Wasteland context required. He was not improvising. He was implementing a carefully considered program. He was also, by this point, no longer Edward Sallow. He had renamed himself Caesar, pronounced the Latin way Caesar, though the soldiers who followed him pronounced it Caesar, and he did not correct them, and he had constructed around that name a mythology sufficiently powerful that even he, who had built it from whole cloth, could not entirely step outside it. The mythology said that Caesar was not a man but an avatar of Mars, the god of war, sent to forge order from chaos. The mythology said that the Legion's mission was not conquest for its own sake, but the necessary work of preparing humanity for a new civilization, that the violence and the enslavement and the cultural erasure were not ends but means, the painful surgery required to cut out the diseased tissue of tribalism and weakness before something healthy could grow in its place. The mythology said that what was coming after the war was worth everything the war cost. Caesar believed this. That is the important thing to understand about him, the thing that distinguishes him from a simple warlord or a simple tyrant. He was not performing conviction. He was not using ideology cynically to justify power he wanted for other reasons. He had reasoned his way to these conclusions from first principles through a process of genuine intellectual engagement with the historical record, and he held them with the specific confidence of a man who has done the work and arrived at what he considers the correct answer. He could be, and on occasion was argued with, on specific points by people who knew enough to challenge him. He was not impervious to evidence, but the foundational convictions, the ones that had produced the Legion and driven it east and now placed it on the bank of the Colorado facing the NCR across 30 years of building, those were not negotiable because they were not arbitrary. They were conclusions, and Caesar had done the math, and he was sure the math was right. Whether the math was right is a question we will return to. Whether the math was right is a question we will return to. But before we examine the Legion structure in detail, it is worth pausing on the figure of Caesar himself, on the specific texture of his certainty, because it shaped every organizational decision that followed. Caesar was not a man who had stumbled into power and then constructed a justification for it. He was a man who had constructed a justification first and then pursued power as a logical consequence of believing the justification was correct. This sequencing mattered. It meant that the ideology was not a mask for appetite, it was the thing itself, the genuine operating system of his decision-making. When he made choices that produced suffering, he experienced that suffering not as a cost to be minimized, but as a necessary feature of the process, the way a surgeon experiences the pain of an incision, regrettable, required, and not a reason to stop. He was not cruel in the way that cruelty is usually understood as an appetite for the pain of others. He was cruel in the way that absolute conviction is cruel, indifferent to the pain of others because the framework within which that pain had meaning was one he had already reasoned his way past. This made him, in certain respects, genuinely admirable. He was consistent. He was not hypocritical. He did not exempt himself from the austerity he demanded of his soldiers. He was personally brave and intellectually serious, and capable of the kind of long-horizon thinking that most leaders, facing the immediate pressures of survival, could not sustain. People who engaged with him directly, including, on rare occasions, representatives of factions that were his enemies, frequently came away with the unsettling impression of having met someone who was genuinely trying to do something coherent, even if what they were trying to do was monstrous. It also made him, in a different set of respects, precisely the kind of person who produces historical catastrophes. Because certainty that is immune to the feedback of the people it affects is not wisdom. It is a closed system, self-referential and self-reinforcing, capable of generating any conclusion that follows from its premises regardless of whether those conclusions correspond to anything in the world outside the theory. Caesar had built a civilization-constructing machine, and he had calibrated it according to his reading of history, and he was running it. What he had not built, what his intellectual framework did not have room for, was a reliable mechanism for checking whether the machine was producing what he thought it was producing, or whether the gap between his theory and his practice was growing in ways that the theory could not see. Chapter 6. The Legion's Structure. To understand the Legion as a military and political force, it is necessary to understand what it actually was, not the mythology that Caesar constructed around it, and not the simplified monster that NCR propaganda portrayed, but the specific organizational reality of a force that had by 2281 conquered or incorporated the equivalent of 24 pre-war states and fielded an army capable of threatening the most powerful nation in the post-war West. The Legion was, at its core, a total war culture. It did not have a military as a distinct institutional component, the way the NCR had an army that existed alongside and separate from the civilian government. The Legion was the military, in the sense that every able-bodied male within it was a soldier, that the entire social and economic structure existed to support the military function, and that the military hierarchy was the only hierarchy that mattered. Caesar was not a president or a king in the conventional sense. He was a general, and the Legion was his army, and the territories it controlled were not a nation with a military, but a military with a territory. This had specific practical consequences. The Legion traveled light and fast because its soldiers were not encumbered by the supply train and the administrative apparatus that slowed conventional armies. It could cover ground at a pace that NCR forces found difficult to match or anticipate. It could concentrate and disperse with a flexibility that conventional force structure did not allow, and it could absorb losses in men, in territory, even in major battles, and reconstitute itself more quickly than an equivalent NCR force could, because the Legion's organizational model was not dependent on the slow institutional processes of a bureaucratic military. When a Legion unit was destroyed, Caesar could form a new one from the next cohort of soldiers who had completed their basic training, equipped with weapons salvaged from the battlefield, and led by officers who had been promoted from the ranks in the immediate aftermath of the defeat. The speed was not recklessness, it was design. The Legion's soldiers were organized into the traditional Roman unit structure that Caesar had adapted from his historical reading. Contuberniums, centuries, cohorts, and legions proper, with ranks derived from Roman military titles. The adaptation was not purely cosmetic. Caesar had studied the Roman unit structure carefully enough to understand why it had worked, the ways in which the specific size and organization of each unit level was calibrated to the human psychology of group cohesion and the practical requirements of pre-modern infantry combat, and he had modified it for the Wasteland context with the same deliberate care he had applied to everything else. The unit sizes were adjusted for the realities of post-apocalyptic equipment and terrain. The command structure was streamlined in ways that allowed faster tactical decision-making. The training protocols were brutal, deliberately, systematically brutal, in a way designed not merely to build physical capability, but to produce psychological transformation, to break down the individual identity of the recruit and replace it with Legion identity, Legion loyalty, Legion purpose. Soldiers who survived the Legion's training were, by most accounts, genuinely formidable. Not because they were individually more capable than NCR soldiers, though the Legion's physical training was rigorous enough to produce a generally high level of individual fitness, but because they operated as a coherent unit in a way that armies organized around less totalizing principles found difficult to achieve. They did not question orders. They did not calculate personal risk in the way that soldiers in volunteer armies sometimes did. They had been trained through a process that modern psychology would recognize as systematic psychological conditioning to experience the Legion's mission as their own most fundamental identity, to the point where the survival of the Legion mattered to them more than their own survival. This made them dangerous in ways that went beyond their tactical competence. The Legion's relationship to slavery was central to its economic and social structure. And it is here that the gap between Caesar's theoretical framework and its practical application was most clearly visible. Caesar justified slavery in the terms of his Roman model, the argument that slavery, as practiced in Rome, had been a transitional institution, a way of incorporating conquered populations into the civilization before the processes of cultural transformation produced full citizens. The slaves of the Legion were, in this framework, not permanently enslaved but provisionally subordinated, undergoing the transformation that would eventually qualify them for fuller participation in the civilization Caesar was building. In practice, the distinction was less clear. The Legion's slave population performed essentially all the non-military labor that kept the force functioning: construction, agriculture, manufacturing, medical care, logistics. The conditions of their servitude were harsh, governed by rules that allowed for extreme violence in response to disobedience and that provided no legal protection for the enslaved against the arbitrary decisions of their owners. The promised transformation into full citizenship was remote and uncertain, dependent on individual performance within a system that provided its evaluators with few incentives to make favorable assessments. Many slaves lived and died in servitude without ever approaching the threshold that Caesar's theory said would bring liberation. The women of the legion occupied a specific and constrained position within its structure. Caesar's Roman model assigned women to domestic and reproductive roles, and the legion implemented this with the same systematic thoroughness it applied to everything else. Women within legion-controlled territory were not soldiers, were not permitted to hold military rank, were not participants in the decision-making processes of the organization. They were wives, breeders, and domestic laborers, their value defined entirely by their relationship to the military men whose civilization they supported. Caesar justified this too, in terms of his historical framework, the argument that functional specialization was necessary for military effectiveness, that a force which assigned its women to combat roles was diluting the specific capability that made it powerful. The argument was coherent within its own premises. The premises were not ones that admitted much dissent. The legion's treatment of conquered populations was calibrated to a specific logic that Caesar had developed from his reading of Roman conquest, overwhelming initial violence followed by reliable order. When the legion arrived at a new territory, the first thing it did was demonstrate, without reservation, its capacity and willingness for mass violence. Settlements that resisted were destroyed, their populations enslaved or killed, the ruins left as a visible message to the next community on the legion's route. This was not indiscriminate. Caesar was clear about the distinction between the violence of the conquest phase and the order of the occupation phase. Once a territory submitted, the legion's administration was, by the standards of the Wasteland, functional. Roads were maintained. Raider activity was suppressed with an efficiency that NCR military forces in adjacent territories could not match. Trade routes were protected. The basic infrastructure of daily life, water, food, shelter, was maintained at a level that, while austere, was reliable. People within legion-controlled territory were, by most accounts, safer from the specific forms of predatory violence, raider attacks, bandit ambushes, the casual cruelty of the strong against the weak that made wasteland life brutal than people in comparable NCR-administered territories. This was not incidental, it was the point. Caesar needed the populations he conquered to function, to work, to produce, to support the military structure that was the legion's reason for existing. A dead or starving population did not serve that purpose, and so the legion provided order, not out of benevolence, but because order was useful. Whether this bargain, safety and order in exchange for absolute submission, the erasure of identity and the permanent subordination of individual freedom to collective purpose, was a good bargain, was something that the people living under it assessed differently depending on what their lives had looked like before the legion arrived. For communities that had been subject to sustained raider predation, the comparison was not always unfavorable to Caesar. For communities that had built functioning, peaceful cultures of their own, the legion's arrival was a catastrophe, the destruction of everything they had built, the murder of those who resisted, the enslavement of those who survived, the systematic elimination of every cultural expression that had given their lives meaning. Caesar did not consider the second group's assessment relevant. He had read his history, and his history told him that the feelings of the people being incorporated into a new civilization were not a reliable guide to whether the incorporation was good for them in the long run. Rome had not asked the Gauls whether they wanted to be Roman. It had made them Roman, and the Gauls had resisted, and eventually most of the resistance had faded, and what remained was something that was neither purely Gallic nor purely Roman, but was, Caesar argued, better than either had been alone. He intended to do the same thing, on the same timescale, with the same indifference to the short-term assessments of the people being transformed. He was, in other words, certain. And certainty, in the wasteland as everywhere else, is both the most useful and the most dangerous quality a leader can possess. There was one other figure in the Legion's early history who demands attention before we move to the collision with the NCR, a man whose story illuminates the distance between the Legion's theory and its practice with particular clarity. His name before the Legion was Joshua Graham. Caesar gave him the title of Legate, the senior military commander of the Legion's forces, the man responsible for translating Caesar's strategic vision into operational reality. Graham was, by most accounts, a genuinely gifted military officer, tactically inventive, personally fearless, capable of inspiring the kind of loyalty in soldiers that is rarer than tactical skill and harder to manufacture. He was also, and this is relevant to what happened to him, a man with his own convictions, convictions that were not entirely congruent with Caesar's. The first Battle of Hoover Dam would test both men. It would reveal something about the legion's structure that Caesar's organizational theory had not adequately modeled, that a total war culture organized around the absolute authority of a single figure is acutely vulnerable to the quality of the decisions made by that figure and by the people he appoints. The legion had no institutional mechanism for correcting a bad decision made at the top. It had no loyal opposition, no checks on command authority, no culture of upward feedback that might have allowed a subordinate to say, without career-ending consequences, that a plan was wrong. It had discipline and coherence and speed. What it did not have was resilience against its own leadership's errors. That gap would cost it the dam, the first time around, and the way Caesar responded to that cost would tell you everything you needed to know about the civilization he was building. By the time the Legion arrived on the eastern bank of the Colorado, it controlled territory stretching from central Utah to the Texas Panhandle, had absorbed or destroyed 86 tribes, and had a fighting force of somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 soldiers. Estimates varied because the Legion did not publish its order of battle. It had taken 30 years. Caesar was in his mid-50s, dealing with the early symptoms of a brain tumor that his medical staff were treating with pre-war technology that was effective but not curative. He knew the clock was running. He had spent 30 years building something that he intended to outlast him, and the test of whether it would was coming. The test was the river. The test was the dam. The test was whatever was on the other side. Chapter 7. The NCR moves west. The new California Republic did not decide to take the Mojave the way that nations in the Old World made decisions, through deliberate strategic planning, through careful assessment of costs and capabilities, through the kind of institutional process that produces a coherent policy with defined objectives and a realistic plan for achieving them. It drifted into the Mojave the way that expanding powers have always drifted into contested territory, one step at a time, each step individually defensible, the cumulative commitment growing beyond anyone's original intention before anyone in a position to stop it had noticed that it had happened. The first NCR presence in Nevada was commercial. Brahman caravans from the Republic's central territories had been working the trade routes east for decades, following the old pre-war highways through the desert toward the ruins of Las Vegas, which even in their degraded state offered something valuable salvage. The pre-war Southwest had been wealthy, and 200 years of decay had not entirely consumed what it had left behind. Electronics, manufacturing equipment, medical supplies, weapons, ammunition, all of it sitting in ruins that were dangerous to access but profitable enough to justify the danger. The caravan operators who ran these routes were not agents of the Republic in any formal sense. They were private commercial interests operating under Republic law, paying Republic taxes, protected in theory by Republic military authority. In practice, they were operating well beyond the effective reach of that authority, relying on their own hired guards and their own accumulated knowledge of the terrain to survive routes that killed the unprepared with reliable regularity. As the commercial traffic increased, so did the pressure on the Republic's government to extend its formal presence into the region. The caravan operators wanted military escorts. The merchants settling in the small communities along the trade routes wanted courts and law enforcement. The prospectors working the ruins wanted property rights and a legal framework for resolving disputes. All of these were reasonable requests, individually, collectively. They amounted to a demand that the Republic extend its administrative infrastructure into a region it had never formally claimed, hundreds of miles beyond its existing frontier, in territory where it had no established military presence and no reliable intelligence about what other forces were operating. The Republic obliged. Not all at once, the process took years, advancing in increments that the politicians in Shady Sands could present to their constituents as modest and measured, even as the cumulative commitment grew into something that was neither. Military outposts were established along the main trade routes. A Mojave regional government was set up, headquartered in the town of McCarran, adjacent to the ruins of the pre-war airport of the same name. NCR law was formally extended to cover the territories west of the Colorado River, and then, inevitably, the dam. The Hoover Dam had been known to Republic scouts for years before the formal annexation of the Mojave. The scouts' reports were consistent. The dam was intact, Structurally sound, still functional in the sense that the turbines were operable if the intake systems were cleared and maintained. The power it could generate, measured against the Republic's existing energy infrastructure, was staggering. The politicians who read those reports did not need to be told what it meant. The dam was the most valuable single piece of infrastructure in the post-war West, and it was sitting unclaimed in a desert that the Republic was already moving into. The question was not whether to take it. The question was how fast and at what cost. The cost turned out to be higher than the initial assessments suggested, for reasons that the assessments had not adequately modeled. The Mojave was not empty territory. It had a population, the communities of Freeside and Westside outside New Vegas, the settlements along the highway corridor, the tribal groups in the surrounding desert, and those populations had existing power arrangements that the NCR's arrival disrupted. Some of those arrangements had involved Mr. House, the artificial intelligence controlling New Vegas, who had his own views about who should control what in the Mojave and was prepared to negotiate from a position of considerable strength. Others had involved local strongmen and tribal leaders who had built small empires in the power vacuum of the uncontrolled desert and who did not welcome the arrival of an external authority with the power to displace them. The NCR handled these complications with the specific mixture of competence and arrogance that characterized its expansion generally. The communities that accepted incorporation quickly were absorbed with reasonable efficiency. The ones that resisted were pacified with military force, which was effective in the short term but generated resentments that fed the low-level insurgency that would plague the Republic's Mojave administration for years afterward. The tribal groups were dealt with through a combination of bribery, coercion, and the kind of treaty-making that both parties understood to be provisional, the Republic offering protections it was not sure it could deliver. The tribes accepting terms they were not sure they would honor, both sides calculating that the immediate accommodation was better than the alternative, while privately planning for the renegotiation they both knew was coming. By the time the NCR established formal control of the Hoover Dam, which they designated Camp Gulf, because the pre-war Gulf resort adjacent to it made a convenient command facility, the Republic's Mojave commitment had already grown beyond what anyone in Shady Sands had originally intended. The dam required a garrison, the garrison required a supply line, the supply line required outposts, the outposts required garrisons. Each element generated the need for the next, and the whole structure expanded outward from the dam like the rings of a stone dropped in still water, until the NCR had tens of thousands of soldiers deployed across a territory the size of a small pre-war state, all of them there, ultimately, to protect the dam and the power it represented. What no one in the Republic's political establishment had adequately accounted for was what was coming from the east. The Mojave administration that the NCR installed was in miniature everything that was wrong with the Republic writ large. The governor's office in McCarran was a patronage appointment, filled by people whose primary qualification was their connection to influential figures back in Shady Sands rather than any experience with the specific challenges of administering a frontier territory under active military pressure. The military command structure was split between officers who answered to the Mojave Regional Commander and officers who maintained separate reporting lines to the Army's Central Command in California, creating a coordination problem that was visible to everyone involved and addressed by no one with the authority to resolve it. The economic policy was extractive in the bluntest sense. Taxes collected from the Mojave's communities flowed west toward Shady Sands, while the services those taxes were supposed to fund materialized slowly, inadequately, or not at all. The soldiers bore the cost of these failures most directly. NCR Army pay in the Mojave had not kept pace with the NCR dollar's ongoing devaluation. The Republic's currency, backed by nothing since the loss of its gold reserves, had been losing value for years, and the soldiers whose contracts specified a fixed number of NCR dollars per month were effectively receiving less purchasing power each year than they had enlisted for. The equipment situation was persistently inadequate. Requests for ammunition resupply, for replacement gear, for medical supplies were processed on timelines that had no relationship to operational need. Soldiers who completed their service terms found their re-enlistment bonuses delayed or reduced by budget processes in Shady Sands that treated the Mojave as a line item rather than a war zone. None of this was secret. The soldiers talked to each other and to the civilians in the communities they were stationed near. The officers wrote reports. The reporters who occasionally made the journey east from California filed stories, and in Shady Sands, the Congress debated the Mojave budget in sessions that were heavily influenced by the Brahman barons and the merchant interests whose caravans were the primary economic beneficiaries of the NCR's military presence there, who wanted the soldiers to stay, but did not want to pay what keeping them there actually cost. The result was a political compromise that satisfied no one, enough funding to maintain the presence, not enough to make it effective, and a persistent rhetorical gap between what the Republic said it was doing in the Mojave and what it was actually doing there, that the soldiers on the ground found, depending on their disposition, either infuriating or grimly amusing. Chapter 8. The Legion crosses the Colorado. The Legion's arrival in the Mojave was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to the Eastern Territories in the years before it happened. The scouts and traders and wanderers who moved through the desert between the Colorado and the NCR's eastern frontier had been reporting for years on the advancing edge of Legion territory, the disappearance of tribes that had previously been trading partners, the appearance of Legion patrols in areas where they had not previously been seen, the specific kind of silence that settled over a region after the Legion had passed through it. These reports reached the NCR's Mojave command. They were passed up the chain. Some of them were acted on. Most were filed and noted, and not acted on with the urgency that the situation warranted, because the NCR's institutional attention was always partially elsewhere, on the political situation in Shady Sands, on the budget negotiations for the Mojave campaign, on the dozen other crises that competed for the attention of an overstretched military command. Caesar had been watching the Mojave for a long time before he moved against it. His intelligence operation, which was genuinely sophisticated, built on a network of explorators, the Legion scouts, who were trained in the kind of patient, systematic reconnaissance that produced actionable intelligence rather than just impressions, had been mapping the NCR's Mojave deployment for years. He knew the garrison sizes, he knew the supply line vulnerabilities, he knew which outposts were undermanned and which were fortified beyond what his initial assault forces could overcome. He knew, in considerable detail, the morale situation of the NCR forces on the Western Bank, the resentment of soldiers who felt underpaid and undersupported, the frustration of officers who felt their operational judgment was being overridden by political appointees, the specific exhaustion of troops who had been deployed in a combat zone for tours that kept extending without adequate rotation or rest. He also knew about the dam in the same way that the NCR's politicians knew about it, as the central strategic asset whose control would determine the outcome of the larger contest. The difference was that Caesar's interest in the dam was not primarily economic. He did not need the power it generated, at least not yet. What he needed was the symbolic and strategic value of taking it from the NCR, the demonstration that the Legion could reach into the heart of the Republic's Western commitment and take the thing the Republic valued most. That demonstration, he calculated, would have effects that went beyond the military. It would affect the political situation in Shady Sands. It would affect the morale of NCR forces throughout the Mojave. It would affect the calculations of the communities and factions in the region that had been watching the two powers and deciding which one to align with. Caesar was thinking 3 moves ahead. He almost always was. The Legion's initial operations in the Mojave were not direct assaults on NCR positions. They were something more methodical, a systematic campaign of pressure designed to shape the battlefield before the main engagement. Legion raiding parties crossed the Colorado at multiple points along its length, striking NCR supply convoys and isolated outposts, then withdrawing before the NCR could bring sufficient force to bear. These raids served several purposes simultaneously. They degraded the NCR's supply situation, forcing the Republic to divert resources to convoy protection that would otherwise have gone to forward positions. They gathered intelligence about NCR response times and tactical capabilities. They demoralized the NCR garrison troops who found themselves under persistent threat from an enemy they could not fix in place or bring to a decisive engagement. And they established, in the minds of the Mojave's civilian population, the impression that the NCR could not protect them, that the Republic's military presence was an ongoing cost without the security it had promised. This last effect was perhaps the most strategically significant, though it was the hardest to quantify. The communities of the Mojave had accepted NCR authority partly because they believed that authority would protect them. The Legion's raiding campaign demonstrated that it would not reliably, not in the outlying areas where most of the population lived. Some communities responded by redoubling their support for the NCR, calculating that the Republic's larger resources made it the better long-term bet despite its current failures. Others began to hedge, maintaining formal NCR loyalty while quietly exploring what accommodation with the Legion might look like. And a few, particularly those with specific grievances against the NCR's administration, began to consider active collaboration with the Legion, providing intelligence about NCR movements and dispositions in exchange for guarantees of safety that the Legion may or may not have intended to honor. The NCR's command in the Mojave was aware of this dynamic and largely unable to address it. The fundamental problem was one of resource allocation. The Republic had committed enough force to the Mojave to make leaving impossible, but not enough to make winning straightforward. Defending the dam, maintaining the supply lines, garrisoning the major population centers, and conducting active operations against Legion forces were together more than the available forces could do simultaneously. Every choice to concentrate resources in one area created vulnerabilities in another, and the Legion's explorators were good enough at their jobs to identify and exploit those vulnerabilities almost as quickly as they were created. This was the tactical situation that produced the first Battle of Hoover Dam. Not a sudden escalation, but the logical culmination of a years-long campaign of attrition and positioning, the moment when Caesar decided that the conditions he had been patiently creating were finally right for the decisive engagement, and gave Legate Joshua Graham the order to cross the river in force. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific nature of the Legion's raiding campaign before the first battle, in what it tells us about the difference between the two forces' approaches to war. The NCR fought the way a state fights, with defined objectives, rules of engagement, institutional accountability, and a persistent concern about how its conduct would be perceived by its own civilian population and its political establishment. These constraints were not weaknesses in themselves, they were the necessary features of a democratic military, the things that distinguished the NCR army from the raider gangs it had spent decades suppressing. But they were constraints, and the Legion operated without them. Legion raiding parties did not take prisoners in the conventional sense. They did not observe ceasefire negotiations. They did not distinguish in their operations between military targets and the civilian infrastructure that supported them, the supply depots, the road repair crews, the water points that kept NCR forward positions viable. They killed everything that moved on routes they wanted to interdict, and the efficiency of this approach was not lost on the NCR commanders who were trying to maintain operations under it. The moral clarity that the Republic brought to the question of how to fight was also a tactical liability, because it imposed costs on the NCR that the Legion did not impose on itself, and in a war of attrition those asymmetric costs accumulate. The NCR's response to the raiding campaign was largely defensive, which was the correct operational response given its resource constraints, and also the psychologically corrosive one. An army that spends its time defending convoys and repairing what the enemy destroys is an army that is being shaped by the enemy's initiative rather than exercising its own. The soldiers knew this. The officers knew this. The inability to do anything about it, given the resources available and the political constraints on escalation, became one of the defining experiences of NCR service in the Mojave, the specific frustration of being well-trained, reasonably equipped, and institutionally prevented from using either quality effectively. Chapter 9. The First Battle of Hoover Dam. The First Battle of Hoover Dam was fought in 2277, 4 years before the events of New Vegas, and it is the pivot on which the entire subsequent history of the Mojave turns. To understand it properly, you have to understand what each side expected to happen. Caesar expected to win. This was not overconfidence, it was a reasonable operational assessment based on the intelligence his explorators had gathered. The NCR garrison at the dam was under strength. The supply situation was degraded by months of Legion raiding. The morale of the NCR forces was poor. The Legion assault force was large, well-organized, and led by the most capable military commander in Caesar's organization. By any conventional military calculus, the Legion should have taken the dam. The NCR expected to hold. This was also a reasonable assessment based on different information. The dam itself was a natural defensive position of considerable strength, a narrow structure with controlled access points surrounded by terrain that favored defenders over attackers. The NCR's soldiers, whatever their morale problems, were equipped with better ranged weapons than the majority of Legion forces, who fought primarily with melee weapons and thrown ordnance by doctrinal preference as well as supply constraints. And the NCR had one asset that its commanders were confident would be decisive, a man named Hanlon, who was the commander of the NCR Rangers, the Republic's elite light infantry force, and who had spent the previous months preparing a defensive plan that he believed could hold the dam against a force substantially larger than what he expected the Legion to deploy. Hanlon was right about the plan. He was also right about what the Legion would deploy. What he had not fully accounted for was the quality of Legate Graham's operational execution. Graham's assault began with a crossing of the Colorado at multiple points simultaneously, a classic envelopment attempt designed to force the NCR defenders to divide their attention and prevent the concentration of force that Hanlon's defensive plan required. The crossings were executed at night, using routes that the Legion's months of reconnaissance had identified as lightly monitored, and the initial waves achieved tactical surprise in several sectors despite the general awareness that a Legion offensive was coming. The fighting on the dam itself was intense and close, the kind of combat that negated the NCR's ranged weapons advantage and played to the Legion's strengths in melee and in the psychological willingness to absorb casualties that the Legion's training produced. For several hours, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The NCR's defensive plan was working in some sectors and failing in others, and the overall situation was fluid enough that the commanders on both sides were making decisions with incomplete information about what was happening across the full extent of the battle. Graham was pushing hard, committing his reserves earlier than he had planned, because the NCR resistance was stronger than his pre-battle assessments had suggested. Hanlon was managing a situation where his carefully prepared plan was being stressed in ways he had not fully anticipated, making real-time adjustments with forces that were already stretched. What turned the battle was not a single decision or a single action, but a cumulative series of small advantages that the NCR accumulated over the course of the engagement, and that by morning had added up to something decisive. Hanlon's Rangers, operating in small units throughout the desert terrain surrounding the dam, had been conducting a parallel operation throughout the night, hitting Legion supply lines, disrupting the coordination between the Legion's multiple crossing forces, creating the kind of confusion in the Legion's rear areas that made it impossible for Graham to get accurate information about his own forces' positions and status. The Legion's communication systems, which were good by Wasteland standards but significantly less sophisticated than the NCR's radio network, could not compensate for this disruption. Graham was fighting partially blind in the battle's critical hours, and the decisions he made on the basis of incomplete information were, in several cases, the wrong ones. By midday, the Legion assault had stalled. The crossing forces that had achieved the deepest penetration were cut off from resupply and reinforcement. The NCR had concentrated its available reserves against the most dangerous Legion penetration and was systematically eliminating it, and Graham, assessing a situation that had moved decisively against him, made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He ordered a general withdrawal back across the Colorado. It was the correct tactical decision. The assault had failed. The situation was deteriorating, and continuing to press it would only add to casualties that the Legion could not afford to absorb without purpose. Any competent military commander in Graham's position would have made the same call. What Graham could not have anticipated, or perhaps what he had chosen not to think about, because thinking about it would have been paralyzing, was how Caesar would receive that decision. Caesar's response to the defeat at Hoover Dam has been discussed and analyzed in the years since by everyone who studies the history of the Mojave conflict, and the analysis usually focuses on the specific punishment he inflicted on Graham, burning and throwing what remained of him into the Grand Canyon. This punishment was, by any standard, extreme, and Caesar was a man who had thought carefully about punishment as an institutional tool, who had calibrated the Legion's disciplinary system with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. He was not acting impulsively. He was acting deliberately for reasons that were, within his framework, coherent. The reasons were these. The Legion's authority rested on Caesar's authority, and Caesar's authority rested on the perception of his infallibility. The Legion's soldiers had been trained to believe that Caesar's strategic vision was correct, that his plans succeeded, that the Legion won. A major defeat, the first significant defeat the Legion had suffered in decades of continuous expansion, threatened that perception. If the defeat could be attributed entirely to the failure of a single subordinate, the narrative of Caesar's infallibility could be preserved. Graham became, in this analysis, not a competent commander who had executed a difficult operation against a stronger-than-expected defense, but a scapegoat, the vessel into which Caesar poured the responsibility for an outcome that had, in some part, reflected the limits of Caesar's own intelligence assessments. Graham survived. This fact is itself remarkable, given what was done to him, and it says something about the specific physical resilience of the man, or about the intervention of whatever providence Graham himself, in the years that followed, attributed it to. He crawled out of the canyon. He walked east into the Utah desert, and he eventually found, or was found by, a community of tribals called the Dead Horses, with whom he spent the subsequent years building something that had no place in Caesar's theoretical framework. A community organized around the idea that individual human beings had inherent worth that was not contingent on their utility to a larger project. But that is another story for another time. What the First Battle of Hoover Dam left behind was a changed strategic situation. The NCR had won, but the victory was expensive and its implications were uncomfortable. The Republic had held the dam, but it had done so at the cost of significant casualties and with a clarity about the Legion's capabilities that made the previous optimism of the Mojave Command look naive in retrospect. The Legion had lost, but it had not been destroyed or even significantly degraded. It had withdrawn in good order, retained its territory east of the Colorado, and demonstrated that it could bring sufficient force to bear on the dam to make any future assault genuinely dangerous. And Caesar, sitting in his fort on the eastern bank, processing the defeat with the specific combination of fury and cold recalculation that characterized him at his worst and his most dangerous, had already begun planning the second attempt. The 4 years between the first and second battles of Hoover Dam were not a peace. They were a stalemate, a grinding, low-intensity conflict that consumed both sides without resolving anything, that damaged the NCR's political situation in ways that would prove as consequential as any military defeat, and that allowed Caesar to rebuild and reposition and wait for the conditions he needed. Understanding those 4 years, what they did to the NCR, what they allowed the Legion to become, and how they set the stage for the final engagement is the subject of the next file. But before we leave the first battle, one detail deserves attention because it illuminates something about the war that the casualty figures and the tactical analyses tend to obscure. In the days after the battle, as the NCR was processing its victory and the Legion was withdrawing across the Colorado, the communities of the Mojave were watching. They were watching which side had held the dam, yes, but they were also watching how each side treated the aftermath, how the NCR handled its wounded, what it did with Legion prisoners, whether the victory produced any improvement in the conditions that had made NCR service so miserable before the battle. And what they saw was an army that had won and immediately reverted to the same arguments about funding and supply and political accountability that had characterized its management of the Mojave before the battle. The victory changed the military situation at the dam. It changed almost nothing else. That observation that the NCR's structural problems were immune to military outcomes was not lost on Caesar. It was, in some ways, the most important intelligence report his explorators could have delivered. The Republic could win battles and still lose the war for the Mojave, because the war for the Mojave was not primarily a military contest. It was a political and institutional one, and the NCR was losing it in ways that no number of tactical victories at the dam could reverse. He would wait. He was very good at waiting. Chapter 10: The Stalemate Years. The 4 years between the first and second battles of Hoover Dam have no clean name in the histories of the Mojave conflict. They are not quite a war, and not quite a peace. The Legion did not stop raiding across the Colorado after the first battle. If anything, the tempo of cross-river operations increased in the months that followed, as if Caesar were deliberately maintaining pressure to prevent the NCR from using the breathing room of a defensive victory to shore up the weaknesses his explorators had spent years identifying. The NCR did not stop fighting either, sending ranger units east of the river on interdiction missions that occasionally produced dramatic tactical successes and consistently failed to produce any lasting strategic effect. Both sides were active, neither side was winning, and the people living in the territory between them were paying the price for a stalemate that the powers conducting it had decided, for their own reasons, to maintain rather than resolve. The NCR's situation in the Mojave during this period was shaped by a dynamic that is familiar from the history of military occupations generally. The gap between the political narrative and the operational reality had grown wide enough that maintaining both simultaneously required a sustained institutional effort that consumed resources and attention that would have been better spent on the actual problem. The political narrative, constructed in shady sands for consumption by an NCR electorate that was paying for the Mojave campaign in taxes and in the lives of its soldiers, held that the Republic was winning, that the victory at Hoover Dam had demonstrated the Legion's inability to dislodge the NCR from its strategic position, that the situation was under control, that the investment was producing returns. The operational reality visible to anyone who spent time at the forward positions or talked honestly with the soldiers stationed there was that the NCR was maintaining its position through an effort that was not sustainable indefinitely, and that was degrading the force conducting it in ways that would eventually matter. The specific mechanisms of that degradation were multiple and mutually reinforcing. The extended deployment tours that the NCR's personnel shortages forced on Mojave soldiers, tours that stretched from the standard 1 year to 18 months, 2 years, in some cases longer, produced the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained psychological stress without adequate relief. Soldiers who had been in the Mojave long enough developed a relationship with the landscape and the mission that was characterized less by dedication than by a grim, habituated endurance, the capacity to keep functioning under conditions that had long since ceased to feel purposeful, maintained by nothing more than the force of routine and the absence of an alternative. This is not cowardice or disloyalty. It is what prolonged institutional failure does to people who are trying, in good faith, to do a difficult job without adequate support. The soldiers of the NCR's Mojave garrison were not broken. They were tired in the deep way that rest alone cannot fix, tired of a situation whose improvement was always promised and never delivered, tired in the specific way of people who have stopped believing that the people responsible for their situation are capable of improving it. The officer corps carried a different but related burden. The professional officers, the ones who had built careers on military competence rather than political connection, could see with a clarity that their formal reporting obligations made it difficult to express that the campaign was structured for failure. The supply situation was inadequate. The intelligence resources were insufficient. The rules of engagement created asymmetries that the Legion exploited systematically. The command structure was divided in ways that prevented effective coordination, and none of these problems were addressable through the mechanisms available to field commanders, because they were not tactical problems, they were political and institutional ones, produced by decisions made in shady sands by people who were not in the Mojave, and whose understanding of the situation there was filtered through layers of institutional optimism that had progressively detached it from anything resembling operational reality. Writing accurate reports meant writing things that the chain of command did not want to read. Not writing them meant contributing to the narrative that was producing the conditions they were living in. Most officers chose some version of the middle path, reports that were technically accurate but strategically misleading, that documented the specific problems they were authorized to document while omitting the larger systemic critique that the situation warranted. This is how institutions die, not all at once but paragraph by paragraph, in the space between what was written and what was true. The civilian population of the Mojave experienced the stalemate differently depending on where they were and what their relationship to the NCR's administration had been before the first battle. The communities along the main highway corridor, the ones that had the most direct economic relationship with the NCR's military presence, that supplied goods and services to the garrison and whose security was most directly dependent on NCR protection, remained broadly loyal, or at least broadly compliant, calculating that the Republic's continued presence was preferable to the alternative. The communities in the outlying areas, further from the main supply routes and less economically integrated with the garrison economy, had a more complicated relationship with the occupation. The NCR's presence in these areas was visible primarily in the form of tax collection and checkpoint enforcement, with the security benefits of that presence distributed thinly enough that the costs were easier to feel than the advantages. These were the communities that provided the Legion's raiding parties with the intelligence about NCR movements that made those raids so consistently effective, not necessarily out of ideological sympathy with the Legion's program, but out of the practical calculation that the NCR's ability to protect them was insufficient to justify the loyalty that the NCR's administration demanded. There is a particular category of person that extended military occupations produce in reliable quantities. The individual who has stopped believing in the institutions they serve but continues to serve them anyway, because the alternatives are worse or because the habit of service has become its own justification. The Mojave during the Stalemate years was full of these people on both sides of every divide. NCR soldiers who had stopped believing the Republic could win, but who kept their posts because going home felt like abandonment. Local administrators who had stopped believing the NCR's promises, but who continued to collect taxes and file reports because the structure of their daily lives depended on the continuation of the arrangement. Merchants who knew the situation was deteriorating, but who kept extending credit to the garrison economy because calling in the debts would collapse the system they depended on. The stalemate was sustained, in large part, by the accumulated weight of these individual accommodations, each one rational in isolation, collectively producing a situation that no one wanted and that no one had the leverage alone to change. The Rangers were the exception to this pattern, or at least the partial exception. The NCR Rangers were the Republic's elite light infantry, the soldiers who had won the first battle and who remained, through the stalemate years, the most operationally effective component of the NCR's Mojave force. They maintained their effectiveness partly because their institutional culture was different from the regular armies, more selective, more demanding, more insulated from the political dynamics that degraded the line units, and partly because their mission, which involved operating in small units in the deep desert, far from the garrison economy and its particular corruptions, kept them in contact with the operational reality that the institutional narrative was papering over. They knew how bad things were. They were also, in some ways, the clearest illustration of the stalemate's fundamental problem. The most capable soldiers in the Mojave could not fix a situation whose causes were political, institutional, and structural, no matter how well they fought or how much ground they covered, or how many Legion raiding parties they intercepted in the dark. Chapter 11: Caesar's Camp and the Legion at Rest. On the eastern bank of the Colorado, in the ruins of a pre-war railroad town called Boulder City and in the sprawling encampment that Caesar had established on the heights above it, the Legion during the stalemate years was doing something that it had not done in the previous 3 decades of continuous expansion. It was consolidating. The pace of territorial acquisition east of the Colorado had slowed significantly after the first battle. The Legion was still absorbing the last of the Arizona and New Mexico tribal territories, still processing the populations of the communities it had incorporated in the years before the Mojave campaign began, still building the administrative infrastructure that turning an army of conquest into a governing institution required. Caesar had decided, or had been forced to decide by the operational reality of the stalemate, that the next crossing of the Colorado would not happen until the conditions for success were substantially better than they had been in 2277, and that creating those conditions required patience and preparation rather than continued pressure. The Legion's camp on the eastern bank was, by the standards of the Wasteland, an extraordinary place. The organization and discipline that Caesar had built into the Legion over 30 years was visible in every aspect of the encampment: the regular layout of the tents and buildings, the cleanliness of the common areas, the absence of the casual disorder that characterized most wasteland settlements. The soldiers were drilled and fit. The supply situation was well managed, the Legion's logistical system having been built specifically for the kind of extended campaign that the Mojave represented. The fortifications were substantial and intelligently designed, reflecting decades of accumulated expertise in the specific engineering problems of defending a river crossing. Anyone arriving at Caesar's camp from the NCR's side of the river and then visiting the NCR's own forward positions would have been struck by the contrast, not in the quality of the weapons or the individual soldiers, which were roughly comparable, but in the institutional coherence of the organizations. The Legion looked like an army that knew what it was doing and why. The NCR looked like an army that had been doing something for a long time and was no longer entirely sure why it was still doing it. Caesar himself, during this period, was managing the first serious institutional challenge the Legion had faced since its founding, the question of succession. His brain tumor, diagnosed in the years before the first battle, had been treated with pre-war medical technology salvaged from various sources, and the treatment had been partially effective. The tumor was controlled, not eliminated, and the symptoms it produced, including persistent headaches and occasional lapses in the specific cognitive clarity that had always been Caesar's most valuable attribute, were a constant reminder that the Legion's future could not be indefinitely deferred. Caesar had always been the Legion. In the most fundamental sense, its ideology was his ideology, its organizational structure was his design. Its military doctrine was his adaptation of historical models that only he fully understood. The question of who or what the Legion would be when he was gone was one that the Legion's institutional structure was not designed to answer, because answering it would have required acknowledging a vulnerability that Caesar's authority depended on concealing. The solution he had arrived at by the time of the stalemate was characteristically elegant and characteristically insufficient. He had elevated a new legate, a man named Lanius, whose tactical effectiveness and whose specific brand of terrifying personal violence made him an effective battlefield commander and a useless strategic thinker. Lanius was not a successor in the intellectual sense. He was a weapon, and weapons do not lead armies. They are aimed by leaders, and when there is no longer a leader to aim them, they find their own targets. Caesar understood this. He had not elevated Lanius as his successor but as his instrument, the operational commander for the second battle he was planning, while he continued to search for the institutional solution that would allow the Legion to survive his death as something more than a very large and very violent raiding force. Whether he ever found that solution is a question the history does not fully answer, because the second battle came before the search was complete. The new legate's approach to the coming battle was different from Graham's in ways that reflected the different minds behind them. Graham had been a tactician, a man who thought in terms of the specific operational problems of moving forces across terrain and engaging enemy positions, who had designed the first battle assault as a carefully choreographed operation intended to achieve a decisive outcome with controlled violence. Lanius was not a tactician in that sense. He was something simpler and in some ways more dangerous. A man who believed that the application of sufficient force, maintained with sufficient determination, would eventually overcome any obstacle, and who had enough raw combat effectiveness to make that belief partially self-fulfilling. His plan for the second battle, to the extent that it can be reconstructed from the available accounts, was essentially to send enough Legion soldiers across the river to overwhelm the NCR's defensive capacity through attrition, to accept the casualties that a frontal assault would cost, and to replace them faster than the NCR could replace its own losses, until the dam fell by the weight of the pressure applied to it. It was not elegant. It had a reasonable chance of working, given the relative sizes of the forces available. What the stalemate years also produced within the Legion's camp was a subtle but significant shift in the relationship between Caesar's ideology and the institution he had built to embody it. In the early decades of the Legion's existence, Caesar had been present at the operational level in a way that kept his theoretical framework in direct contact with the practical reality of what the Legion was doing. He had been in the field, he had made decisions, he had seen the consequences of his doctrine applied to specific human beings in specific circumstances, and whatever his conclusions about those consequences, he had at least had the information. By the time of the stalemate, Caesar was not in the field. He was in his camp, managing an empire from a command tent, receiving information filtered through subordinates whose institutional incentives did not always align with the accuracy of what they reported. The gap between what Caesar's ideology said the Legion was and what the Legion had become in practice, in the behavior of its soldiers toward civilian populations, in the administration of its slave economy, in the specific texture of daily life in Legion-controlled territory, had been growing for years, and Caesar was not in a position to see it clearly. This is not an unusual trajectory for revolutionary movements that achieve enough success to become governing institutions. The ideology that drives the revolution is calibrated for the conditions of the struggle for mobilization, for cohesion under pressure, for the specific kind of collective purpose that fighting a war requires. When the struggle succeeds and the institution must govern rather than fight, the ideology is rarely adequate to the new requirements because governing is a different problem from fighting, one that demands different capabilities and tolerates different kinds of failure. Caesar had built an instrument of conquest and was trying to convert it into an instrument of governance without the time or the institutional capacity to manage the transformation properly. The Legion was changing around him, developing in the specific direction that large, violent, hierarchical organizations tend to develop when their founding generation ages, and the ideological clarity of the founding mission fades into institutional routine. It was becoming what all armies eventually become when they stop fighting, a bureaucracy with weapons, organized around the preservation of its own institutional interests rather than the mission that had originally justified its existence. Caesar could see this happening from his tent on the eastern bank, and he did not have a solution for it. The second battle was in part an attempt to solve an institutional problem with a military event, to restore the Legion's founding clarity by giving it a decisive victory to point to remind it of what it was for, by demonstrating that it could still do what it had been built to do.
Chapter 12: New Vegas and Mr. House. Any account of the Mojave conflict that does not address New Vegas is an account of a war with one of its major combatants missing, because New Vegas was not a neutral bystander to the contest between the NCR and the Legion. It was the third force in a three-way standoff, the one that both sides had chosen to defer dealing with because dealing with it would have required resources they needed for dealing with each other, and because the entity controlling New Vegas had spent 200 years becoming very difficult to deal with. Robert Edwin House was, by 2281, the oldest living human being in the post-war world, if human being was still the right term for what he had become. Born in 2020, a pre-war industrialist whose company, Robco Industries, had produced the Pip-Boy and a range of other consumer and military technology, House had anticipated the war with sufficient accuracy to prepare for it in ways that went beyond the vault tech bunkers available to the general public. He had sealed himself in a life support chamber beneath the Lucky 38 casino, connected to a network of computers and robotic systems that he had spent decades designing specifically to allow him to continue operating the city of Las Vegas through whatever followed the bombs. His body had been sustained past the point of normal biological viability by the life support systems. He was, by the time of the stalemate, a withered physical remnant attached to machinery, his consciousness interfaced directly with the computer network that ran New Vegas. He had been awake and operational in some form for 210 years. He was not entirely sane in the way that any mind operating for that long under those conditions would not be entirely sane. But he was operational, and he was intelligent, and he had a plan. The plan was, in its essential outlines, simple. House intended to use New Vegas as the economic and technological base for a new civilization that would, within a generation or two, surpass the pre-war world in capability and ambition. He intended to launch a space program. He intended to break the cycle of post-apocalyptic barbarism, the endless loop of resource extraction and conflict and institutional decay, by establishing in New Vegas and the surrounding region the kind of stable, technologically advancing civilization that could eventually reach for the stars rather than scrabbling in the ruins of the old world indefinitely. He had, to this end, made himself indispensable to the Mojave's economy, organizing the three major casino families, the chairman, the Omertas, and the White Glove Society, into a functioning municipal administration that kept New Vegas running and profitable. He had repaired and activated the Securitron robots that served as his enforcement arm. He had stockpiled technology and supplies in quantities that made him genuinely powerful in a material sense, independent of whatever military forces either the NCR or the Legion could bring to bear. His relationship with the NCR during the stalemate years was one of negotiated coexistence that neither side was fully satisfied with. The Republic needed New Vegas's economic output. The caps that flowed through the casinos represented a significant fraction of the Mojave's economic activity, and taxing that activity, even at the rates that House's negotiating position allowed the NCR to extract, was worth more to the Republic's Mojave budget than the cost of the military presence required to enforce the arrangement. House needed the NCR's military presence to prevent the Legion from crossing the river and ending his project before it reached the stage where it could defend itself. Each side was using the other, and each side knew the other knew it, and the arrangement held because the alternative was worse for both of them than the accommodation they had reached. House's view of the Legion was simpler and colder than his view of the NCR. He had studied Caesar's ideology with the careful attention of a man who had spent 2 centuries watching human political systems rise and fall, and his assessment was that the Legion was a historical dead end, that Caesar's Roman model, whatever its short-term effectiveness as a military organizing principle, had no viable path to the kind of technological and institutional advancement that House's long-term plan required. A civilization that suppressed women, enslaved its conquered populations, and organized its entire social structure around military function could not generate the scientific and economic dynamism that spaceflight required. The Legion, in House's analysis, was not a civilization in the making. It was a very effective instrument of destruction that had mistaken itself for a civilization, and its eventual collapse was as certain as the collapse of every purely militarist culture in the historical record. The question was not whether the Legion would fall, but whether it would fall before or after it destroyed New Vegas, and House had spent considerable effort ensuring that the answer was before. The Mojave that the courier, the unnamed protagonist of the New Vegas story,
The individual whose choices would determine the outcome of the second battle, walked into in 2281, was therefore not a simple two-sided war. It was a three-way contest between the NCR's exhausted, corrupt, genuinely well-intentioned democratic republic, Caesar's brutal, coherent, philosophically serious military theocracy, and House's autocratic, far-sighted, deeply strange technocratic project, three answers to the question of what civilization should look like, arrayed around a dam on a desert river, waiting for the event that would force a resolution. What made this contest philosophically interesting, beyond its immediate military stakes, was that each of the three positions contained a genuine critique of the other two that was difficult to dismiss. The NCR's critique of the Legion was obvious and accurate. A civilization built on slavery and the erasure of individual identity was not a civilization worth building, regardless of how effectively it suppressed raider activity. The Legion's critique of the NCR was also obvious and also accurate, a democracy captured by its wealthiest citizens, sending its soldiers to die for the economic interests of Brahman barons, while those soldiers went unpaid and undersupplied, was not a democracy in any meaningful sense, and the restoration of the pre-war world's political forms without the pre-war world's material conditions was nostalgia masquerading as governance. And House's critique of both was the most sweeping and in some ways the most uncomfortable, that the contest between the NCR and the Legion was a contest between two variants of the same fundamental mistake, the assumption that the post-war world's problems could be solved with political and military tools rather than technological and economic ones, that the question of who controlled the dam was less important than the question of what you were going to build once you had the power it generated. None of these critiques were wrong. All of them were incomplete. And the war that was about to settle the immediate question of who controlled the Mojave would not settle the deeper questions that each position raised, because wars are not capable of settling philosophical arguments. They can only determine which side gets to continue making its argument from a position of material advantage. That event was coming. The second battle could not be deferred much longer, and everyone in the Mojave who was paying attention knew it. The river was still moving, indifferent as always, carrying its silt south toward a delta that no longer existed, waiting for the sound of guns that would tell it nothing it needed to know. Chapter 13. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam did not begin the way battles in the Old World began, with a declaration, a formal crossing of some recognized threshold, a moment that historians could later point to and say, here, this is where it started. It began the way wars in the Wasteland usually began, with a gradual intensification of something that had never entirely stopped, a slow turning up of pressure that passed through several stages before anyone on either side was willing to call what was happening a battle rather than an escalation. The Legion's cross-river activity in the weeks before the main assault increased in frequency and depth. NCR outposts that had previously seen occasional raids began reporting nightly contact. Supply convoys that had been harassed sporadically found themselves under sustained interdiction, and the explorators, the Legion scouts, those patient and invisible men who had been mapping the western bank for years, disappeared from their usual patterns, which meant either that they had pulled back because the information-gathering phase was complete, or that they had moved to positions from which the main assault would be staged and were maintaining the kind of silence that precedes action rather than the kind that precedes withdrawal. General Lee Oliver, the commander of the NCR's Mojave forces, had been expecting the assault for months. His intelligence was good enough to tell him that something was coming, and his experience in the Mojave was long enough that he could read the pattern of Legion activity the way an experienced soldier reads terrain, not just what was visible but what the visible things implied about what was not. What his intelligence could not tell him was the exact timing, the exact axis of advance, or the exact size of the force the Legion intended to commit. These uncertainties shaped his defensive preparations in ways that, in retrospect, would be identified as both his greatest strength and his most significant vulnerability. He had prepared for multiple contingencies, which meant his forces were distributed to cover multiple approaches rather than concentrated at the point of maximum threat. The distribution was sound defensive doctrine. It was also exactly the posture that Lanius's assault plan had been designed to exploit. The assault began before dawn. The Legion's main crossing came at the dam itself, a frontal attack of the kind that military doctrine almost universally advises against, conducted with the specific ferocity that Lanius had built his reputation on, and that the Legion's soldiers, trained to absorb casualties without breaking, were uniquely capable of sustaining. The NCR's defensive positions on and around the dam were strong, carefully prepared, manned by soldiers who knew what was coming and had been as ready as the Republic's resource situation allowed them to be. The fighting was immediate and close and brutal in the way that fighting over fixed structures is always brutal. No maneuver, no clever flanking, just the application of force against prepared defense at ranges where the outcome was determined less by tactical sophistication than by the raw willingness of each side to keep feeding men into the contact. Simultaneously, Legion forces crossed the river at multiple points north and south of the dam, using routes that the explorators had identified as weakly defended, and that the NCR's distributed posture had left exactly as weakly defended as the Legion's reconnaissance had suggested. These flanking crossings were not the main effort, they were the shaping operation, designed to pull NCR reserves away from the dam and prevent Oliver from reinforcing his most critical position with the forces he had available elsewhere. The mechanics were the same as the first battle. Because the mechanics had been sound, it was the execution that had failed the first time, and Lanius intended to execute them with a pressure and a pace that the NCR's response capability could not match. For the first several hours, the Legion's plan was working. The flanking crossings drew exactly the responses they were designed to draw. NCR units that had been positioned as reserves found themselves committed to contain Legion penetrations on the flanks, depleting the pool of forces available to reinforce the dam. The fighting at the dam itself was going badly for the NCR's forward positions. The Legion was taking enormous casualties but not stopping, not slowing, pressing the assault with the kind of sustained commitment that the NCR's soldiers, watching it from behind their fortifications, found genuinely alarming, not because it was tactically sophisticated, but because it was not. The Legion was not trying to be clever, it was trying to break the dam's defenses through the simple mathematics of attrition, and the mathematics were not yet clearly favoring either side. What changed the battle was not a single dramatic event, but a convergence of several smaller ones, each individually insufficient but collectively decisive. The NCR's Ranger battalions, operating with the autonomy that their doctrine and their institutional culture allowed, began conducting deep interdiction operations against the Legion's crossing points, targeting the logistics infrastructure that kept the assault waves supplied and the communication nodes that allowed Lanius to coordinate his multiple simultaneous operations. These operations did not stop the assault, they complicated it, introducing delays and uncertainties into the Legion's operational picture that forced Lanius to make decisions with less information than his plan had assumed he would have. The decisions he made under that uncertainty were not wrong exactly, but they were slower and more cautious than his initial approach had been, and the slowdown was enough to allow the NCR's defensive line at the dam to stabilize in ways that the first hours of the assault had suggested it might not. Oliver's handling of his reserves in the battle's critical middle hours has been analyzed extensively in the years since, and the assessments are divided. His critics argue that he committed his best units too late, that a more aggressive concentration of force at the dam in the assault's first phase would have broken the Legion's momentum before it could build to the sustained pressure that made the battle's outcome so uncertain for so long. His defenders argue that the flanking crossings were real threats that required real responses, that the hindsight assessment of their relative importance compared to the main assault was not available to Oliver in real time, and that his management of a complex, multi-front battle with inadequate reserves and imperfect communications was, under the circumstances, competent. Both assessments contain truth. The more interesting observation is that Oliver was managing a battle whose fundamental parameters had been shaped by years of political decisions that he had not made and could not change: the supply situation, the manpower levels, the distribution of forces across a theater too large for the available assets, and that his tactical decisions, good or bad, were operating within constraints that made decisive outcomes difficult, regardless of the specific choices he made. The battle's resolution came not through the kind of climactic engagement that military histories tend to emphasize, but through the slower accumulation of tactical outcomes across multiple engagement points over the course of a day and a night and the following morning. The Legion's flanking forces, having achieved their initial crossings, found themselves unable to exploit those crossings into the kind of deep penetration that would have threatened the NCR's lines of communication and forced a general withdrawal. The NCR's Rangers and the committed reserve units contained the flanking forces at significant cost, but effectively enough to prevent the operational collapse the Legion's plan required.
And at the dam itself, the Legion's assault, which had been magnificent in its ferocity and terrible in its cost, ultimately could not convert that ferocity into the physical control of the structure that was its objective. The fortifications held, the NCR soldiers defending them held, and Lanius, assessing a situation in which his assault force had bled itself against prepared defenses without achieving its objectives, and in which his flanking forces were contained, and his logistics were disrupted, and his timeline had extended well beyond the window in which the assault's shock effect could be sustained, made the decision to withdraw.
It was the second time the Legion had crossed the Colorado in force and come back without the dam. The operational consequences were significant. The strategic consequences were enormous, and the human cost on both sides, in the bodies left on and around the dam and in the desert approaches to the river crossings, was the kind of number that does not fit easily into any framework that makes sense of it. Chapter 14. What each side was really fighting for. Wars are never entirely about what they appear to be about. The stated objectives, territory, resources, political recognition, the control of a specific piece of infrastructure on a desert river are real enough, and the fighting that produces or fails to produce those objectives is real in the most brutal and immediate sense. But underneath the stated objectives, in the specific choices each side makes about how to fight and what to sacrifice and what to preserve, there is always something else. The answer to the question of what kind of world each side is trying to produce, and whether the methods they are using to produce it are consistent with that goal. The NCR fought for the Mojave with a combination of genuine idealism and institutional corruption that was not a contradiction but a feature, the specific expression of a civilization that had encoded its founding values in its institutional structures and then watched those structures get captured by interests that were indifferent or hostile to those values. The soldiers who served in the Mojave were, in many cases, people who genuinely believed in what the Republic was supposed to represent: law, order, the protection of the individual from the predatory violence that the Wasteland's default condition imposed. They had enlisted because they believed that the NCR was the best available answer to the question of how to build something worth living in from the ruins of the old world. That belief was not naive. Most of them understood at some level that the Republic was imperfect, that the gap between what it claimed to be and what it was had grown uncomfortable. But imperfect was not the same as wrong, and the alternative that was camped on the eastern bank of the Colorado was not imperfect in an ordinary way. It was wrong in a fundamental one, and the soldiers defending the dam knew it, and that knowledge sustained them through conditions that would have broken people fighting for something less clearly preferable to the available alternative. The NCR's political leadership fought for the Mojave with fewer of those beliefs intact. The Brahman barons and the congressional representatives and the generals whose careers depended on the success of the campaign had long since translated the idealistic language of the Republic's founding into the more comfortable vocabulary of interest: economic interest, political interest, institutional interest. The dam was valuable. New Vegas was valuable. The trade routes were valuable. The soldiers were an expense. This was not cynicism in the sense of deliberate hypocrisy. Most of the people making these calculations believed they were making them in the service of the Republic, that their interests and the Republic's interests were the same thing. The problem was structural. A political system that allowed wealth to translate directly into political power would always produce leaders whose understanding of the Republic's interests was shaped by the perspective of the wealthy. And the wealthy always found a way to believe that what was good for them was good for everyone. The Legion fought for the Mojave with a clarity of purpose that the NCR could not match, and a philosophical foundation that did not survive close examination. Caesar's soldiers knew what they were fighting for, in the immediate operational sense, with a precision that the NCR's soldiers often lacked: the dam, the crossing, the defeat of the enemy in front of them, the advancement of the Legion's mission, which was Caesar's mission, which was the mission of civilization itself as Caesar understood it. That clarity was genuinely valuable. It produced cohesion and commitment and the willingness to absorb casualties that made the Legion a formidable military force. But the philosophical foundation that generated it, the argument that the Legion was the necessary precondition for a new and better civilization, did not hold up against the evidence of what the Legion actually was in the territories it controlled, to the people living in them. Caesar's argument was, at its core, a consequentialist one. The suffering the Legion imposed on the present generation was justified by the civilization it would produce for future generations, in the same way that the suffering of the people incorporated into Rome had been justified by the civilization that Rome eventually built. The problem with this argument was not its logical structure. Consequentialist arguments about the costs of civilization building are not inherently wrong, but its empirical basis. Caesar had read about Rome from a position of knowing how Rome turned out, with the benefit of the full historical arc visible in retrospect. He was making decisions in real time, without that retrospective clarity, in conditions that were not identical to the conditions Rome had operated in, using a model that had been derived from a historical record that was itself incomplete and contested. The confidence with which he applied that model was not justified by the epistemic situation he was actually in. He was not Rome's founders who did not know they were building Rome. He was a man who had read about Rome's founders and decided he was doing the same thing, and the decision to cast himself in that role had foreclosed his ability to ask whether the casting was accurate. What the Legion was actually building in the territories it controlled was not a proto-Roman civilization progressing towards something that would eventually surpass its origins. It was a military culture that had achieved stability by eliminating everything that was not the military culture, and that had no mechanism for developing beyond that point because development requires the kind of creative freedom that the Legion systematically destroyed. The slaves who did the Legion's productive work were not being prepared for citizenship. They were being worked in conditions that precluded the development of the skills and the social trust that citizenship required. The women who maintained the Legion's domestic infrastructure were not in a transitional phase before a broader integration. They were in a permanent subordination that the Legion's ideology had no path out of. The soldiers who had been shaped by the Legion's training into instruments of collective purpose were not citizens in formation. They were people whose individual identities had been so thoroughly overwritten by the Legion's institutional identity that the civilization Caesar promised to build from them, the one that would eventually relax its disciplines and allow individual flourishing, was being built from material that the Legion's own processes had made incapable of it. This is the specific tragedy of Caesar's project, seen from the outside. A man of genuine intelligence and genuine commitment who had built exactly what he intended to build, and whose intention was wrong in a way that his framework could not see. He had read the history of civilizations and concluded that the problem was always too much freedom, too much fragmentation, too much tolerance for the individual variance that prevented collective action. He had not read, or had read, and not weighted correctly, the history of what happened to civilizations that solved the fragmentation problem by eliminating the individuals. Rome had not been great because of its discipline. It had been great despite its discipline, because alongside the legions and the roads and the administrative apparatus, there had been the poets and the philosophers and the engineers and the merchants and the ordinary people living ordinary lives in ordinary towns, all of them doing things that were not the military mission, but that were, collectively, the civilization. Caesar had kept the legions and the roads and thrown everything else away, and what remained was not a civilization in embryo. It was a military force that had mistaken its own discipline for destiny. The river between them did not care about any of this. The Colorado had been moving south since before the first human being walked the continent, carrying whatever the land above it chose to put into it, ice melt and silt and the debris of storms, and for 200 years the specific residue of a civilization that had ended badly. It would keep moving after the battle was over, after the soldiers had gone home or died or dispersed into the desert, after the flags had changed or stayed the same, or been replaced by something else entirely. The water did not know what it was carrying, it just moved, the way water always moves, finding the path of least resistance, carrying everything south toward a delta that had been dying before the bombs fell and that the bombs had finished, toward an ocean that was still there, still receiving whatever the land chose to send it, indifferent and patient and permanent, in a way that nothing the people on its banks had built or destroyed could touch. Chapter 15. Aftermath. The question of what the Second Battle of Hoover Dam settled is easier to answer than the question of what it meant. In the immediate operational sense, it settled the question of who controlled the dam, for the moment, under the specific conditions that obtained in 2281, with the specific forces that each side had deployed and the specific choices that each side's commanders had made. The NCR held the dam. The Legion withdrew. The flags above the dam stayed the same. In that narrow sense, the battle was decisive. In every other sense, it was not. The NCR's structural problems, the political capture, the supply failures, the morale decay, the gap between the Republic's stated values and its actual conduct were not resolved by the battle's outcome. The soldiers who had defended the dam went back to the same inadequate supply situation, the same overextended deployment, the same institutional dynamics that had made the Mojave campaign so costly and so demoralizing before the battle. The political leadership in Shady Sands processed the victory as confirmation of the campaign's essential soundness, which made the structural reforms that might have addressed the underlying problems even less likely than they had been before. The battle had been expensive, and it had been won, and the lesson the political class drew from that sequence was that the expense was justified, not that it was a symptom of something that needed fixing. The Legion's situation after the second battle was more immediately dire, but in some ways more honestly assessed. The defeat was a fact that Caesar's institutional mythology could not easily paper over. This was not a tactical setback at a peripheral location, but a second failure to take the objective that the entire Western campaign had been organized around at enormous cost in soldiers that the Legion had spent years training. Caesar's response to this defeat was different from his response to the first one. He did not produce a scapegoat. He could not. Lanius had not failed through incompetence, had not made the kind of identifiable error that could carry the weight of institutional responsibility the way Graham's withdrawal had. The defeat was the defeat, and Caesar, facing it with the specific combination of physical deterioration and institutional pressure that characterized his situation in the battle's aftermath, began a process of reassessment that he had not previously been willing to undertake. Whether that reassessment would have produced anything useful is a question that the history does not answer, because the history of the Mojave after the second battle depends on choices made by someone who was not Caesar and not Oliver and not Lanius, someone who arrived in the Mojave with no institutional affiliation and no prior stake in the outcome, and who therefore had the freedom to do something that none of the established players could do, to look at the situation as it actually was rather than as their position within it required them to see it. That person's choices and what they produced are a different story from the one we have been telling. The war between the NCR and the Legion was a story about institutions, about what institutions build and what they destroy, about the gap between what organizations claim to stand for and what they actually do, about the specific ways that good intentions and bad structures interact to produce outcomes that neither the intentions nor the structures, separately considered, would predict. The Courier's story is a story about a person, and persons operate differently from institutions, and the things a person can do that institutions cannot are, depending on your perspective, either the most hopeful or the most unsettling thing about human history. What the war left behind in the desert and in the communities that had lived through it was the particular residue that all wars leave, the physical destruction, the dead, the specific psychological damage that sustained violence does to the people who survive it. But it also left something that wars less philosophically serious than this one do not always leave, a set of genuinely open questions about civilization, about what it is for and what it costs and who gets to decide, that the battle's outcome had not resolved and that the people still living in the Mojave would have to continue living with. The dam was still there. The river was still moving, the lights of New Vegas were still on, and somewhere in the desert, the people who had built their lives in the space between two armies were doing what people in such spaces have always done, continuing, adapting, finding the specific accommodations that survival requires, and waiting to see what the next thing would be. The Colorado River enters the Gulf of California on the far side of the Sonoran Desert, in a place that was once a delta of extraordinary biological richness, a maze of channels and marshes and tidal flats that supported hundreds of species and that the pre-war world had drained almost to nothing through a century of upstream diversions before the bombs made the whole question academic. The delta is gone now, or mostly gone, replaced by the cracked mud and salt flats that are what a river delta becomes when it stops receiving water. The river still reaches the Gulf most years. In dry years it does not. In the post-war world, with the climate changed by the war's effects layered on top of the climate changes that had already been underway before it, the question of whether the Colorado reaches the sea in any given year is one that the people living along its banks have learned to hold with uncertainty. There is something appropriate about that uncertainty, though appropriateness is not a category that rivers recognize. The Colorado has been running the same basic course for 5 or 6 million years, long before anything that could care about appropriateness had evolved to notice it. The human drama that played out on its banks in 2281, the armies and the ideologies, and the dam and the battle is, from the river's perspective, indistinguishable from the 1,000 other dramas that have played out along its course over the millennia. Cultures rose and fell along the Colorado long before the United States existed, and long before the Great War ended it. The ancestral Puebloans built their cities in the canyons and abandoned them 1,000 years ago for reasons that archaeologists still debate. The Hohokam built irrigation systems that dwarfed anything the NCR had constructed and then disappeared from the historical record with the same completeness that the post-war world had come to regard as normal. The river kept moving through all of it. The New California Republic and Caesar's Legion are not the last civilizations that will rise on the banks of that river. They may not even be the most interesting. What they were was a specific and instructive experiment in the post-war world's central question, not who wins, because someone always wins, but what winning means, and what it costs, and whether the civilization that survives the contest is better or worse than the ones that were consumed by it. That question does not have a permanent answer. It has to be answered again by every generation that inherits the consequences of the previous generation's choices, in every landscape that has been shaped by the specific violence and the specific generosity of the people who lived in it before. The desert gets cold at night, even in the summer. The temperature drops fast once the sun goes down, the heat that the rock absorbed during the day radiating back into the clear sky, and the stars come out in numbers that people who grew up in the old world's light-polluted cities never saw, and that people who grew up in the post-war world take for granted in a way that does not diminish their beauty. The Milky Way is visible from the banks of the Colorado on a clear night, a smear of light across the dark that contains, among its hundreds of billions of stars, the sun that this planet orbits, seen from the outside, seen as what it actually is, rather than what it looks like from down here. It is late. The fire is low. Whatever you are carrying into this night, set it down for a little while. The river is still moving. The stars are still there. Sleep well.